Okay, so this is going to be the first recording for the heart. So the cardiovascular system is going to consist of the heart, the blood vessels, and the blood. And essentially what your heart is, this is going to be the pump that will pump the blood, which is the liquid carrying oxygen and nutrients, into the blood vessels, which will travel through a system of tubes that will then distribute it through the entire cardiovascular system. Now, the heart is somewhat of a cone-shaped organ. It is situated slightly to the left side in the thoracic cavity, posterior to the sternum, so behind the sternum, and it will rest on the diaphragm. The apex, which is the point of the cone, will actually point towards the left hip. The flattened base is the posterior side, not the inferior side, facing the posterior rib cage. Relatively small organ. It's only about the size of a fist, and it's generally less than about a pound. So here you can see the heart sort of nestled in there between the lungs. You can see that if you kind of go down the midline here, the heart is definitely more on the left-hand side than the right-hand side. This is actually going to affect the landscape of the lung itself, and you'll notice that the left lung is actually going to be smaller than the right lung. In fact, the left lung actually only has 2 lobes versus the right lung, which has 3 lobes. Here's the apex. This is pointing towards the left hip, and then you can see the base of the heart laying right on the diaphragm here. This is looking at a lateral view. They removed the left lung, so you can see how the heart is nestled within there. Now, the heart's going to contain several chambers. You're going to have the superior right and left atria, and you're going to have an inferior right and left ventricle. Externally, indentations known as the atrioventricular sulcus is the boundary between the atria and the ventricles. The intraventricular sulcus, this is an external depression between the right and left ventricles. And here you can see the 4 primary chambers. We have the right atrium here. This is going to be receiving blood from systemic circulation. I'll define that in a second. Then you have the right ventricle here, which will pump blood to the pulmonary circulation. Over here, we have the left atria, which is receiving blood back from the pulmonary circuit. And then the left ventricle here, which will pump blood out through the systemic circuit. So both the right and left atria will receive blood from veins. And the definition of a vein is a blood vessel that's going to return blood to the heart. Blood drains from the atria into the ventricles, and the ventricles are the actual pumps where the muscle will contract and pump blood into the arteries. And a definition for arteries is a blood vessel that carries blood away from the heart. The great vessels, these are the main vessels, the main veins and the main arteries that are going to bring blood to and from the heart. Now, the heart itself, although it's a single structure, is functionally going to operate as 2 separate pumps in one. And we're going to divide this up between the right side and the left side. So the heart is divided functionally into right and left sides. The right side of the heart is the pulmonary pump. This pumps blood into a series of blood vessels leading to and within the lung, collectively referred to as the pulmonary circuit. The primary purpose of the pulmonary circuit is to oxygenate the blood, release the CO2, and then return that blood back to the heart to be pumped into what we're going to define in a minute as the systemic circuits. So the pulmonary arteries of the pulmonary circuit will deliver oxygen-poor and carbon dioxide-rich, what we refer to as quote-unquote deoxygenated blood, to the lungs. Gas exchange will take place between the tiny air sacs in the lung, which are referred to as alveoli, and the smallest vessels of the pulmonary circuit, which we refer to as the pulmonary capillaries. Oxygen will then diffuse from the air into the alveoli, into the blood, and then into the pulmonary capillaries. Carbon dioxide diffuses from the blood in the pulmonary capillaries to the air in the alveoli to be expired. So this is that gas exchange and the movement of the gases that you're seeing within the capillaries of the lungs. Veins of the pulmonary circuit will then deliver this oxygen-rich blood, which we refer to as oxygenated blood, back to the left side of the heart. Okay, so here, if we look at this little image, your vena caves, which are the two great vessels delivering systemic blood back to the heart, are going to deliver the blood into the right atrium here. Okay, the blood will then flow due to pressure into the right ventricle. When the right ventricle contracts, it then will transfer blood through the pulmonary arteries into the pulmonary circulation, where it will become oxygenated. That oxygen-rich blood will now travel back via the pulmonary veins to the left atria, where it will then travel into the left ventricle. And when the heart contracts again, that blood will then get pumped out through the aorta and into systemic circulation. Which brings us to the left side of the heart. The left side of the heart is your systemic pump. It's going to receive oxygenated blood from the pulmonary veins and pump it into the vessels that serve the rest of the body, referred to as a systemic circuit. In the systemic circuit, arteries deliver oxygenated blood to the smallest blood vessels, referred to as capillaries. Here, gas exchange occurs again, but in reverse. Now oxygen will diffuse from the blood to the tissues, and CO2 will diffuse from the tissues back into the blood. And then once you leave the systemic capillaries, you're going to pick up waste products to be excreted, but you'll also distribute hormones to their target cells throughout the body. As a result of the gas exchange in the tissues, blood is deoxygenated, and the veins of the systemic circuit will then deliver it back to the right side of the heart to be pumped back into the pulmonary circuit. And you're going to start the whole cycle all over again. The pulmonary circuit is a much more lower pressure circuit, meaning that the force at which the blood is leaving the right ventricle is going to be much less than the force of the blood leaving the left ventricle to go into systemic circuit. And the primary reason for this is that on the right side, you're just pumping blood to the lungs, which is right next door. On the left side, you have to pump blood to get it all the way down to your toes, and then from your toes back up to the heart. And you need a strong, high pressure to be able to accomplish that. So here's a little bit of a summary of the systemic circuit. Okay, so we have our blood returning from systemic circuit via the vena caves, again into the right atrium here, travels into the right ventricle, then pumps out through the pulmonary arteries to go to pulmonary circuit, comes back in through the from the pulmonary circuit via the pulmonary veins into the left ventricle. Okay, from the left ventricle, it then goes into the left atria. From the left atria, it then goes into the left ventricle, out through the aorta, and then through systemic circulation, and then returns back through the venous system, eventually back through those vena caves there. So the heart helps to maintain homeostasis of pressure that the blood exerts on blood vessels, and this is referred to as blood pressure. The rate and the force of the heart's contraction are the major factors that influence blood pressure and blood flow to the organs. The heart, specifically the atria, also act as an endocrine organ, and they will produce what we refer to as atrial natriuretic peptide. Now you may remember ANP from the endocrine system. This is secreted by the heart. It will lower blood pressure by decreasing the amount of sodium ion retention by the kidneys. If you decrease the amount of sodium you're retaining, you decrease the amount of fluids you're retaining, which means the volume of blood goes down. If the volume of blood goes down, the pressure goes down. Okay, so now we're going to actually look at some of the heart anatomy and the actual blood flow pathway. So starting with the anatomy, let's first talk about the covering of the heart. This is the pericardium. This is a membranous structure that surrounds the heart. There are two layers to this. The first layer is the fibrous pericardium. This is the outer layer. It is composed of collagen bundles that make it tough, anchor the heart to the diaphragm and the great vessels. With the low distensibility, this doesn't change the shape or size considerably when stretching forces are applied. So the fibrous pericardium provides that low distensibility, meaning that the heart can overfill. It's still going to have limits because it's sort of this tough connective tissue is going to prevent it from expanding out too far. The serous pericardium, this is a thin inner serous membrane that produces serous fluid. The parietal pericardium, this is fused to the inner surface of the fibrous pericardium. It encases the heart-like sac. At great vessels, it folds under itself to form another layer that adheres directly to the heart. The visceral pericardium, this is the innermost layer, also known as the epicardium, and it is considered the most superficial layer of the heart wall. The pericardial cavity is the space between the parietal and the visceral pericardia, and this will actually contain the very thin layer of serous fluid, referred to as pericardial fluid. This fluid acts as a lubricant, decreasing the friction as the heart moves. The visceral pericardium rests on top of the thin layer of areolar connective tissue, and this will actually contain large fat deposits. The myocardium is deep to the connective tissue, second and thickest layer of the heart wall. When you look at the myocardium, this is cardiac muscle. The cardiac muscle tissue consists of cardiac muscle cells referred to as myocytes and the surrounding extracellular matrix. The cardiac muscle cells are attached to and woven through the fibrous skeleton, composed of dense, irregular, collagenous connective tissue. The fibrous skeleton will function to give the cardiac muscle cells something on which to pull when they contract. They will also provide the structural support of the heart, and they act as an insulator for the heart's electrical activity. The lumen of the heart is going to be lined with endocardium, and this is the third and deepest layer of the heart. This is composed of a special type of simple squamous epithelium referred to as the endothelium, and several layers of connective tissue with elastic and collagen fibers. The endothelial cells of the endocardium are continuous with the endothelial cells that line the blood vessels and share many functions. And here we can see the pericardial sac here, okay? You can see how it is anchoring itself to the diaphragm here, as well as the great vessels there. And if we look at the different layers, we can see the pericardium. Here you can see the epicardium, okay? The muscle wall, and then the endocardium, all right? It's better seen here with this little cutout. And here you can see the coverings of the heart right here and the anchorings. A thoracotomy, this is when the thoracic cavity is opened up in a surgical procedure known as a thoracotomy. This is performed when surgeons must gain access to the thoracic organs, surrounding blood vessels, or the anterior side of the thoracic vertebral column. Generally, it involves an incision in the chest wall and cutting through either the sternum or the ribs, separated and held apart with an instrument called a retractor or rib spreader. This creates a window into the thoracic cavity. When the procedure is completed, the chest wall is closed and the chest tube must be inserted to prevent air from leaking into the thoracic cavity and potentially causing collapse of the lung. We'll talk about those pressures with the lungs and how that closed system needs to be maintained when we get to the respiratory system. The heart consists of 4 chambers, 2 atria and 2 ventricles as we described above. The atria will receive blood from the veins and pump blood into the ventricles through valves. The valves will have flaps that close when the ventricles contract, keeping blood moving moving backwards. The contracting ventricles will then eject the blood into the arteries, carry the blood through either the systemic or pulmonary circuit, depending on what side of the heart you're on. The great vessels, again, these are going to bring blood to and away from the heart, the largest in the body. The major systemic veins, these are 2 veins that drain a majority of the systemic circuit, and these are the superior and inferior vena cava. Both have a large openings into the posterior aspect of the right atrium. The superior vena cava drains deoxygenated blood from the veins superior to the diaphragm. The inferior vena cava drains deoxygenated blood from the veins inferior to the diaphragm. The pulmonary trunk, this is the largest vessel in the pulmonary circuit. It receives deoxygenated blood pumped from the right ventricle. This originates from the right ventricle on the anterior aspect of the heart, nearly along the midline, splits into the right and left pulmonary arteries, bringing deoxygenated blood to the right and left lungs respectively. The pulmonary arteries will branch extensively inside the lungs to become tiny pulmonary capillaries where gases are exchanged. Oxygenated blood in the pulmonary capillaries returns to the heart via a set of pulmonary veins. Most people have 4, 2 from each lung. They will drain oxygenated blood into the posterior part of the left atrium. The aorta, this will supply the entire systemic circuit with oxygenated blood. This is the largest and thickest artery in the systemic circuit and in the entire body. It arises from the left ventricle as the ascending aorta, curves to the left, and makes a U-turn to form the aortic arch. Here you can see the 2 vena cavas right here, inferior, superior vena cava feeding into the right atrium, and then we have our aorta right here coming off of the left ventricle. And you can see the aorta right here, okay? We don't really see the vena cavas very well there. Here we have our pulmonary arteries coming off the pulmonary trunk. And then we have our pulmonary veins right here, okay? Here you can see the inferior vena cava and the superior vena cava. I'm going to stop right here and I'll pick up, I have a Zoom meeting to attend, so I will pick up with this slide in the second recording.